In the frozen darkness of December 1944, as snow gathered along the fir trees of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler revealed the plan he believed would reverse the course of the entire war. He called it Wacht am Rhein, a watch on the Rhine, though the name was meant to deceive German staff officers and Allied intelligence alike. In reality, it was an all-or-nothing offensive designed to smash through the thinly held American lines in Belgium, cross the Meuse River, recapture Antwerp, and split the British and American armies in half. The scale of the dream was astonishing. The flaw beneath it was fatal. Hitler imagined that the Wehrmacht of late 1944 could repeat the lightning victories of 1940, armored spearheads driving fast and deep, breaking enemy cohesion before they could react. He talked endlessly of tempo, of speed, of the inner fire that once made German troops unstoppable. He told his generals that this operation would show the world the Third Reich was far from defeated. But the generals who listened knew something their Führer refused to acknowledge. This was no longer the army of 1940. This was an army fighting on fumes, literally. Germany had no fuel. By December 1944, the Reich's logistics system had collapsed under Allied strategic bombing. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Politz, and Blechhammer lay in ruins. Reserves were almost gone. Every armored division in the West had been bled of fuel for months as the Eastern Front devoured the last drops fighting the Red Army. The 6th Panzer Army, spearhead of the Ardennes attack, possessed some of the most powerful tanks ever built, Panthers and Tiger IIs, but most had only half or even a third of the fuel they required. A Tiger II needed up to 500 liters just to move 20 kilometers across rough ground. The entire operation required hundreds of thousands of gallons that Germany simply did not have. Staff officers begged Hitler to accept the truth. Colonel General Alfred Jodl warned that even if the initial breakthrough succeeded, the armored spearheads would sputter out somewhere between the Our River and the Meuse River. General von Manteuffel and General Model both highlighted the same issue. Fuel shortages were so severe that speed, the very foundation of the plan, was mathematically impossible. Hitler waved them away. "We will take fuel from the Americans," he snapped. "Their stocks will be captured intact. The enemy will provide for us." The idea was breathtaking in its detachment from reality. For an offensive intended to reach Antwerp, a distance of nearly 150 kilometers through forest, hills, and narrow roads, Hitler's entire fuel calculus rested on the assumption that American depots would fall neatly into German hands. It was strategy by wishful thinking, a gambler trying to win a war on luck instead of logistics. Yet inside the Führer bunker, opposition withered. Many generals knew the plan was doomed but lacked the power or the courage to challenge him. They could see the truth. German divisions were under strength. Luftwaffe support was almost non-existent. Artillery ammunition was rationed to the last shell, and infantry replacements were made up of boys, convalescents, and Volksgrenadiers with inadequate training. Still, Hitler demanded offensive spirit over reality. "The Ardennes will show the world what German willpower can achieve," he insisted. He spoke as though morale could replace gasoline, as though enthusiasm could move a 57-ton Königstiger up an icy slope. Meanwhile, the Americans across the lines were in a lull, thinly stretched and unsuspecting, their frontline units composed largely of inexperienced divisions. Hitler saw weakness and believed he could exploit it, but he never considered what it actually took to move a mechanized army across thick forests in winter. In the planning rooms of OKW, one detail loomed over everything: the roads. Ardennes roads were little more than frozen ribbons winding between ridges. Traffic jams were inevitable even for a well-fueled army. For the Germans, with hundreds of vehicles siphoning from the same tiny reserve, it meant disaster. And yet one unit was expected to break through faster than all others. One unit was given the deepest penetration route, the most ambitious timeline,
and the most unrealistic fuel requirements. Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, a ruthless but capable commander from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart Adolf Hitler. His orders were explicit: smash the American front line, seize bridges, bypass resistance, cross the Meuse River, and reach Antwerp. His fuel? Barely enough to get started. The staff at Leibstandart warned that Kampfgruppe Peiper would run dry unless it captured American fuel dumps along the way. The plan demanded that armored spearheads behave like ghosts, materializing out of the forest, racing at impossible speed, and refueling on fuel they hadn't yet captured. It bordered on fantasy. And as the countdown to December 16th approached, Peiper began to understand just how thin the illusion was. His vehicles, Tiger IIs, Panthers, half-tracks, flak wagons, and supply trucks began rolling toward the front line in the Loschem Gap. They immediately stalled. Traffic jams choked the forest before the battle had even begun. Volk's grenadier divisions clogged the roads. Tanks idled for hours, burning precious fuel they couldn't afford to lose. Snow and ice slowed everything. When Peiper's officers checked fuel gauges, they were horrified. Many Panthers had already burned a third of their supply before firing a shot. The mighty Tiger IIs were gasping, and the offensive hadn't even started. Yet Hitler still believed in his vision, an armored thrust racing toward Antwerp as if the Wehrmacht was still fueled, reinforced, and unstoppable. It was the opening act of a tragedy built not on steel or strategy, but on the delusion that an army could win a mechanized war without gasoline. From the moment Kampfgruppe Peiper began moving toward the starting line on the night of December 15th to 16th, 1944, the illusion of Hitler's grand offensive began to crack. Peiper's armored column, Panthers, Tiger IIs, Panzer IVs, SD KFZ 251 half-tracks, flak wagons, fuel trucks, motorcycle messengers, and supply vehicles stretched for miles through the dense Ardennes forest. According to the plan, they were supposed to slip silently into position by dawn, erupt forward with unstoppable momentum, and smash through the American 99th Infantry Division before the enemy could react. But before they even reached the front, the spearhead stalled. The roads leading from the German side of the Schnee Eifel were narrow, frozen, and choked with Volk's grenadier units moving into attack positions. Trucks spun on ice, tanks idled for hours in the cold, and officers cursed into the night as columns backed up in a snarl of exhaust fumes and shouted orders. Every minute of idling cost liters of precious fuel. The offensive had not even begun, and yet Peiper's tanks were already burning the reserves meant for the breakthrough. A Panther could consume more than 4 liters of gasoline per kilometer. A Tiger II, many times that. Peiper checked his gauges and frowned. Some tanks were already down to half. Still, the order was absolute: proceed. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the German assault finally erupted across the Ardennes. The initial infantry attacks went well. The thin American lines at Losheim and Hofen buckled under the weight of the offensive. But Peiper's armored force remained trapped in the traffic jam of its own army's making. Hours passed before he reached the front. The delay suffocated the very concept of blitzkrieg, which depended on speed and speed alone to overcome defenders. When his column finally moved, it surged with desperation rather than confidence. Trees blurred past as half-tracks bounced over frozen ruts. Tank engines roared, consuming fuel at a rate Peiper could scarcely afford. His men were trained, motivated, and aggressive. His tanks were some of the finest in the world, but their fuel tanks were nearly empty. At 4:30 a.m. on December 17, Peiper was finally unleashed. He punched through the American positions near Lanzarote, bypassing pockets of resistance, pushing west faster than any German unit in the Ardennes. His mission was clear: reach the Meuse before the Allies could organize. But even as he advanced, the fuel reports grew worse. A battalion commander radioed that several tanks had run dry and were abandoned until fuel could be brought up. Peiper grimaced. There was no fuel to bring up. He had been promised that the path ahead would contain American dumps, depots full of everything his tanks needed to reach the muss. But that was a dream, not a fact. His vehicles rolled past burning American jeeps, smashed artillery pieces, and frozen infantry foxholes, but the fuel he needed was nowhere. And every mile brought them closer to the moment the last drop would run out. Then, at Bullingen, hope flickered. American trucks, captured intact, filled with fuel cans. Peiper's men fell on them like starving wolves. They siphoned, pumped, and poured every drop into their tanks. Engines revived, spirits rose, the offensive lurched forward again. But even this stroke of luck came with bitter clarity. The mighty SS Panzer Spearhead, Hitler's pride, the tip of the entire Ardennes offensive, was not running on German reserves. It was running on fuel stolen from enemy trucks. And that, Peiper knew, was not how real offensives were fought. Still, he pushed on. The Americans at the crossroads of Hansfeld were caught by surprise early that morning. Peiper's reconnaissance platoons stormed into the village, blasting through the American perimeter with grenades and machine gun fire. U.S. soldiers fled westward, abandoning vehicles, equipment, weapons, and one thing Peiper desperately needed: fuel. Here it was, the prize, the miracle. Near barns, garages, and roadside depots, Peiper found what German intelligence had barely dared to hope for. Rows of 5-gallon jerry cans, fuel drums, tanker trucks still half full. In total, roughly 50,000 gallons of gasoline lay before him. His men shouted with relief. After hours of watching fuel gauges creep toward empty, this was salvation. Engines roared back to life. Panther after panther drank deeply from the captured supplies. Tiger IIs, monstrous and thirsty, guzzled whatever the troops could pour fast enough. Peiper watched the scene, the clatter of pumps echoing through the cold morning, the nervous adrenaline of his men shifting into something like triumph. But behind his steel-blue stare, another realization took shape. Heavy, cold, unwelcome. This wasn't a sign of success. It was proof of failure. The entire offensive depended on moments like this, stumbling upon American fuel by luck, by timing, by sheer coincidence. Hitler had built the operation's logistics not on reserves, not on planning, but on fantasy. If the Americans had torched those depots before retreating, Peiper's advance would have died that morning. If the Americans had defended Hansfeld longer, those tanks would have run dry mid-battle. If one more traffic jam had slowed him the night before, he wouldn't have reached the fuel in time. This offensive was not a plan. It was a bet, and not a rational one, a gambler's bet, made by a leader who refused to accept the reality of Germany's collapse. He sensed it keenly. He was no ordinary staff officer. He had led armored thrusts across Ukraine, had driven deep behind enemy lines, and knew what mechanized warfare required. Fuel wasn't just supply, it was oxygen, and an army without oxygen suffocates. His men cheered as they fueled their tanks, but Peiper's jaw tightened. The miracle at Hansfeld was exactly the kind of miracle the offensive needed every day to succeed, and no offensive in history had ever been built on miracles. Still, orders were orders. Peiper climbed back into his half-track. Engines thundered. Tracks bit into the frozen road. The column rolled westward once more. But now Peiper understood something Hitler did not. They were not a spearhead breaking through enemy lines. They were a spearhead held together by luck, flowing forward on borrowed gasoline, and one bad hour from collapse. And the Americans were beginning to regroup. The window for victory was already closing.
When Kampfgruppe Peiper rolled into Hansfeld shortly after dawn on December 17, 1944, the battle for the village barely lasted minutes. The American 99th Infantry Division, caught in the chaos of the German breakthrough, had left in haste.
Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, kitchen trailers, artillery tractors, and ammunition carriers littered the streets. But Peiper's eyes were not searching for weapons. He was searching for one thing only: fuel. His Panthers rumbled in low gear, engines coughing from hunger. His Tiger IIs were running on fumes. Half-tracks that should have been ferrying infantry were already sputtering. And then he saw it, what every German tanker dreamed of in the Ardennes. Rows of 5-gallon gasoline cans stacked beside a barn, untouched. A trailer truck abandoned with its engine still warm. Drums, full drums lined up beside a maintenance shed. Even by a conservative estimate, the haul approached 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, enough to keep Kampfgruppe Peiper moving for another day, enough to let the spearhead live. Peiper's men shouted with relief. Engineers and mechanics rushed forward like men possessed, tearing open canisters, hauling hoses, rolling drums across the snow. Panther crews climbed atop their turrets, the breath steaming from their faces as they worked the pumps, pouring gallon after gallon into the tanks that had been bleeding dry since the previous night. Tiger II crews, knowing exactly how fast their monsters consumed fuel, filled every internal tank, every jerry can, every container they could strap to the hull. The scene was almost jubilant, an armored force starving for fuel suddenly feasting on an American depot so perfectly preserved it looked staged for their arrival. To the average soldier, it felt like fate. To Peiper, it felt like proof. For weeks, he had listened to Hitler's assurances that the Panzers would take fuel from the Americans, that Allied depots would fall into German hands untouched, that the Ardennes would be a repeat of the 1940 Blitz through the same forest. Peiper had not believed it then. And now, standing amid a jackpot of American gasoline, he believed it even less. Yes, this fuel kept his Tigers and Panthers alive. Yes, it rescued the spearhead for another few hours, but it also illuminated the fundamental insanity of the operation. If this depot had not existed, if the Americans had burned it, if weather had slowed his column even one more hour, Kampfgruppe Peiper would already be finished. The fate of the Reich's last great armored offensive rested not on planning, but on luck. And no general, not even a loyal SS officer like Peiper, could build a campaign on luck. As Panthers drank the last drops from the captured drums, Peiper studied the map on the hood of his command half-track. They were far behind schedule. The Meuse was still more than 60 kilometers away. The American defense was stiffening. The roads were narrow, icy, and choked. And there was no guarantee of more fuel ahead. Everything his men had gained in Hansfeld was temporary, a band-aid on a dying patient. But there was no time to dwell. His orders were absolute. Push forward at maximum speed, no matter the obstacles, no matter the cost. The column moved again, surging westward through the Ardennes like a steel avalanche. Yet every engine sound reminded him of the truth. Each kilometer consumed fuel he did not have. Every detour drained his tanks. Every delay was a death sentence. And delays were everywhere. The narrow Belgian roads became clogged with wrecks, disabled vehicles, and sharp turns impossible for Tiger IIs to negotiate without halting traffic. American engineers blew bridges in front of him, forcing detours. At Bullingen, he had been lucky. At Hansfeld, he had been blessed. But luck could not last. Even the most aggressive commander in the Waffen-SS could not outrun mathematics. His tanks required hundreds of gallons to continue. He had found only tens of thousands in Hansfeld, and the offensive required hundreds of thousands. As Peiper crossed the Amblev River and pressed toward Stavelot, the first grim realization settled on his shoulders. The moment the Panthers and Tigers burned through the fuel from Hansfeld, the offensive would collapse. And this collapse would have nothing to do with American resistance, Allied air power, or poor tactics. It would come down to the one thing no commander could fight without: fuel. What Peiper had captured that morning was not a victory. It was evidence. Evidence that Hitler's plan had never been achievable. Evidence that Germany's last gamble had been built on a lie. Evidence that the offensive was already dying, even as the tanks roared forward. Hansfeld gave Peiper fuel. As Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed westward beyond Hansfeld,
The initial excitement of capturing 50,000 gallons faded into the harsh arithmetic of armored warfare. Fuel was life, and life was burning away with every kilometer. The terrain tightened into twisting valley roads, the cold deepened, American resistance stiffened. Peiper had momentum, but his engines were devouring fuel faster than the offensive could sustain, and he knew it. By the afternoon of December 17, Peiper's spearhead hit Stavelot, a town that became the pivot on which the entire German advance would swing. If Peiper could seize Stavelot quickly, he could cross the Amblève River, bypass major American units, and open the road toward Trapont and the Meuse. But the Americans were no longer retreating in confusion. They were forming lines, blowing bridges, laying mines, and funneling reinforcements toward the German thrust. At Stavelot, the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, a battle-tested unit, rolled in with armor support. They were not surprised, they were not unprepared, and they had fuel dumps deeper in the rear. The German timetable, already shredded by delays, was beginning to dissolve completely. Kampfgruppe Peiper crashed into the town with its signature brutality. Panthers firing into buildings, half-tracks disgorging SS grenadiers, but the resistance was ferocious. Peiper broke through only by slamming full force into the American lines, paying in blood and burned-out vehicles. The crossing of the Amblève cost him time he could not afford. And while time ticked away, a worse threat appeared in the east. American engineers blew the crucial bridge at Trapont just minutes before Peiper's lead vehicles reached it. The road to the Meuse, the entire reason for his advance, was now a dead end. Peiper stared at the collapsed bridge, the smoke rising from wooden beams drifting into the winter air, and the realization settled in deeper. Hitler's plan required everything to go right, and everything was going wrong. Still, he tried to keep the illusion alive. He pivoted south toward La Glaise. That pivot alone devoured hundreds of gallons. The Panther crews were already rationing engine time. Tiger II commanders reported tanks running below 1/4 capacity. Fuel trucks assigned to Peiper's Kampfgruppe, already few in number, could not reach him because of American counterattacks, blown bridges, and impossible bottlenecks. Peiper understood the significance instantly. With no fuel trucks, there was no resupply. And without resupply, his entire armored spearhead would, in his words, die in place. Then came another blow. As Peiper fought through Stavelot again on December 18, trying to secure the bridge and reopen his route, the Americans counterattacked with tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion and infantry from the 119th Regiment. He held them off temporarily, but at a terrible cost in fuel and momentum. Every tank duel meant engines running longer. Every roadblock meant more idling. Every firefight meant another hour off his timetable. And all the while, American gasoline depots ahead were increasingly torched before he arrived. The miracle of Honsfeld was not repeating. The Americans were learning. By the night of December 18, Peiper's radio men intercepted reports that U.S. fuel convoys were being redirected far behind the lines to prevent more captures. What had been the foundation of Hitler's dream, seizing enemy fuel, was disappearing. Now, the offensive's backbone snapped. Peiper's Panthers and Tiger IIs were burning their last reserves. His half-track stalled on the roadside, abandoned by crews when fuel ran out. His supply trucks were ambushed or cut off. The roads around Stavelot clogged with broken vehicles, blocking escape routes. Some of his officers still clung to Hitler's fantasy. They argued they could still reach the Meuse. Peiper looked at the map and knew better. They had nowhere near the fuel required. A Tiger II needed nearly 1,000 liters just to advance 30 kilometers in winter. They had enough for perhaps 5. The nearest surviving bridge across the Amblève was defended. The Americans had air superiority now that the weather was clearing, and the U.S. Army, unlike the Germans, was not running out of gasoline.
Standing near his command half-track, Peiper told a subordinate officer a sentence that later surfaced in post-war interviews. "We do not have a strategic operation. We have a raid. A raid, fast, violent, temporary, and doomed once fuel ran out." That was the moment the illusion shattered. The truth crystallized. Hitler's plan had never been viable. German fuel reserves could not support a mechanized drive to the Meuse. Every kilometer gained had been purchased with gasoline they did not own. The success of Hohnsfeld had been a fluke, not a foundation. And Kampfgruppe Peiper, the strongest armored thrust of the entire Ardennes offensive, was now a steel spear with no shaft behind it. The offensive no longer depended on tactics. It depended on physics, logistics, and the simple fact that engines cannot run on ideology. Peiper captured 50,000 gallons. He captured towns, bridges, and prisoners, but he could not capture a miracle every day. And without miracles, Hitler's offensive was collapsing faster than his tanks were running dry.
By December 21, 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper was no longer a spearhead but a cornered beast, trapped in the hills and frozen villages around La Glaise, surrounded by American infantry, armor, and worst of all, time. Time meant engines cooling. Engines cooling meant fuel burning off just to keep them warm. And the moment those engines went cold, the last operational Panthers and Tiger IIs of Peiper's force would never move again. Peiper knew it. His officers knew it. His men, huddled in cellars and behind shattered walls as American artillery pounded the village, knew it too. The 50,000 gallons captured at Hohnsfeld were gone, burned crossing rivers, clawing through bottlenecks, fighting American counterattacks at Stevelat, Trapance, and Chenay. The miracle that had kept his column alive had carried them not to the Meuse, but into a dead end. The roads behind them were cut. The bridges were blown. American tanks blocked every southern and western route. And to the east, where fuel trucks and reinforcements should have been, there was nothing but silence. The Germans could not reach him. The last desperate radio messages from 6th Panzer Army headquarters offered no relief, only hollow encouragement and orders to hold fast. Peiper's fuel officers delivered the final blow. Most Panther and Tiger II crews were down to fumes. Some tanks had a handful of liters left, others were dry. The mathematics Hitler had ignored had now become a death sentence. Without fuel, a mechanized spearhead becomes a static target. Without movement, Peiper's tanks, symbols of Nazi armored might, were reduced to steel coffins waiting to be cracked open by the Americans. The U.S. First Army sensed the weakness. Task Force Lovelady, Task Force McGeorge, and elements of the 30th Infantry Division tightened the noose around La Glaise. American tank destroyers probed the outskirts. Sherman tanks rolled up with confidence. The Luftwaffe was gone and U.S. artillery dominated the battlefield. Every hour more units arrived. The fog that had once shielded the Germans had lifted. Clear skies meant Allied air power hunted anything that tried to move. Peiper attempted breakouts, first west, then east, but each time he found roadblocks, minefields, or American armor blocking the route. Finally, on the night of December 23, the end arrived. Peiper gathered his officers in a dim cellar lit by a single lantern. Maps were laid on overturned crates. The Tiger IIs outside were silent giants in the snow, their engines long since shut down to conserve fuel that no longer existed. The Panthers were ghost shapes behind fences and barns. Peiper's reconnaissance officers reported the truth bluntly. "We are completely cut off. There is no path for the vehicles." Peiper asked the question none of them wanted to hear. How much fuel remains? The answer? Not enough to move more than a few hundred meters. And that was it. The great armored thrust, the pride of the Waffen-SS, the force Hitler believed would smash America's lines and reach Antwerp, had been defeated not by battlefield destruction, but by immobilization. The tanks were alive, but paralyzed. Peiper made his decision with cold clarity. The Kampfgruppe would abandon its vehicles,
destroy what it could not move, and escape on foot through the forest. At midnight, grenadiers climbed onto the tigers and panthers they had fought in for years, padding armor plates like saying goodbye to old comrades. Charges were set, fuel tanks were ignited. Flames climbed into the night sky as Peiper's steel giants burned. In the morning, the Americans would find them. 30 Panthers, 7 Tiger IIs, dozens of half-tracks, flak wagons, and trucks. All useless, all empty. All sacrificed because Germany had attempted a mechanized offensive without mechanized logistics. Peiper led 800 men out of La Glaise, slipping through ravines, dodging American patrols, abandoning equipment piece by piece as they trudged eastward. They arrived days later as a ragged remnant, hungry, exhausted, frozen. They had survived, but the offensive they were meant to spearhead had died in the snow. When German commanders reviewed the campaign afterward, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Ardennes offensive had collapsed not because Allied forces were strong, but because the German plan was impossible. The entire operation rested on the idea that fuel would magically appear in American depots, just as it had at Hansfeld. But miracles don't repeat. Blitzkrieg does not run on hope. And a 57-ton Tiger II does not move because Adolf Hitler wills it to. Peiper's moment of clarity standing among the 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld was the truth all along. The offensive was a fantasy, and the fuel dump that saved his column for a day was nothing but evidence of a plan already doomed. When the engines died at La Glaise, so did Hitler's last gamble.